Good evening, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the Arboricultural Association's latest Wednesday webinar. It's the last one of the series. Boo! I'm John Parker, Chief Exec at the Association and your host for tonight. As ever, please do say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're watching from and submit any questions you may have through the Q&A button, and we'll work through as many as we can at the end. Tonight, we're going to be learning about trees and storms with a focus on Florida from two fantastic speakers, Allyson Salisbury and Andrew Koeser. At this point, I would normally tell you to register for next week's webinar, but I can't do that because we haven't got one. But they will return later in the year, I promise. And in the meantime, we've got loads of fantastic events going on, lots of them in person. We've got a Women in Arboriculture event at Kew Gardens at the end of March. We've got Arb Show at Westonbirt in May. And of course, we've got conference at Warwick in September. But more importantly than any of that, tonight, I will achieve previously unheard of levels of respectability when I give a presentation to the Stonehouse Women's Institute, which starts at 7:30, which means we're finishing promptly and I'm jumping in the car and heading straight over there. With no webinars to promote, I'll give you the normal things to think about, like join us as a member or make a donation to us because we are, of course, a charity. And because this is the last one of the series, I would also like to say thank you to everyone who's contributed. Charlotte Bancroft, Dan Lamb, Chris Knappman, Yarrick Collerick, Martin Tusher, Claire Harbinson, Simon Parfey, Charles Miners, Liz Nichols, Sharon Durden-Hollenby, Luke Fay, Reg Harris, Ted Green, and the whole panel who contributed to the retrenchment discussion. Thank you all. Thank you to my team here at the Association for doing all of the actual hard work, particularly to Andrew, who's given up his Wednesday nights for your viewing pleasure. And of course, thank you to all of you. It's a privilege to be part of this wonderful tree community. But let's not get all weepy and emotional just yet, because there's still plenty of time for it to go horribly wrong. Of course it won't. Of course it won't. We've got two brilliant presentations to go. First of all, it's my great pleasure to welcome Allyson Salisbury to the virtual stage. Allyson, it's over to you.
Yeah, okay. We are diving in. Let me clear my throat, which is probably going to happen a bunch because I am recovering from COVID. So I appreciate your patience with my voice. So hello and welcome. I'm really excited to join you this evening or this afternoon or whatever time it is, wherever you are in the world, to talk about tropical cyclones and tree damage. So I'm an environmental scientist and an urban ecologist. I'm really broadly interested in how to help trees grow better in difficult places. I should say other plants too. Sometimes I work with not trees. This is a photo of me standing in front of a pile of treated sewage sludge that was in the process of being turned into a new planting site next to a highway in Illinois. Currently, I'm a research data analyst and writer. I work for two different research teams, one at the University of Florida, where today's research was based, and at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That's a completely different project that we'll gloss over today. I want to begin by acknowledging my many, many collaborators on this project. This has certainly been a group effort, and I have to especially shout out my multilingual collaborators who helped make a portion of this literature review possible. So tropical cyclones, also called hurricanes, are no joke. In the United States, hurricane-related damage costs us approximately $17 billion a year. And again, that's just in the US. That number is a very high dollar value. It really also doesn't begin to cover the emotional and the psychological costs of people whose lives are completely upended by these natural disasters. And this is not simply a North American or East Coast of North America problem. This graph shows the tracks of tropical cyclones across the world for the past, tropical cyclones that made landfall across the world for the past 50 years, I believe. And I just share this map to highlight that tropical cyclones are absolutely a global phenomenon. As a very quick vocabulary detour, tropical cyclones go by many names. Tropical cyclone is probably the most science-y term for this weather phenomenon and the most generic. The term hurricane is generally applied to tropical cyclones that originate in the Atlantic Ocean. As a little fun history note, the word comes from the Taino word for huracan, which means evil wind spirit. Feels kind of appropriate descriptor. While in the Pacific Basin, tropical cyclones are usually referred to as typhoons in English. And that's a kind of rough approximation for the Chinese word typhoon, which means big wind, also a very accurate descriptor of this weather. During this talk, I'm mostly going to alternate between hurricane and tropical cyclone, but know that for our purposes, I'm using these terms interchangeably. So this project got started when some of my colleagues were tasked with creating an updated version of this thing called the Tampa Tree Matrix. There's a little screenshot of it here. This is a really nifty online tool. It lists native species that are appropriate to plant in Tampa, Florida, and the surrounding region. At the time, it provides some basic tree information, such as the tree's height and maturity, as well as its wind resistance rating. I imagine you have a similar plant list for your own city or region. Our team noticed that only about 60% of species on this list had wind resistance ratings, which is certainly better than no wind resistance ratings, but also maybe seem to be an important gap because if you're not aware, hurricanes hit Florida quite regularly. So the wind resistance ratings we did have were based on two seminal papers by Mary Daria and other researchers from 2007. Following several hurricanes that affected Florida in the early 2000s, Mary and her team systematically recorded hurricane damage to urban trees in Florida. They also reached out to professional arborists to gather expert opinions on wind resistance of local tree species. Their research led to the classification of 145 palm and tree species that are commonly found in Florida and Puerto Rican cities. And this is a great list, and it's really important information that helps improve how we select trees for hurricane-prone environments. There's a drawback, though, with their method, which is that there's not really a clear or easy way to add new species into this classification scheme. And we thought that was both kind of a problem, but perhaps also an opportunity to expand the classification system. So we decided that one workaround for this issue would be to develop a wind resistance prediction model, kind of using their classification scheme as a starting point. And we hope this model will be able to assign ratings to new species in a systematic and repeatable way. And so that is an ongoing project that is kind of in progress at the moment, this new prediction system. But before we could get that project going, we first realized that it would probably be a good idea to create a comprehensive list of characteristics of trees and their environments that could be good predictors of tree damage during a hurricane. And the search for those predictors is what the rest of this talk is going to focus on today. So we set out to answer this question by conducting a comprehensive literature review. And I like to think of conducting a literature review as kind of like going fishing with a net. To start with, you have to find a good place to go fishing. Our search began by looking through Google Scholar, which is a search engine for science papers. And we were using a pretty broad set of keywords that I have listed here. But I as we got going, I really didn't think that searching Google Scholar for only English papers papers written in English was enough. I thought we should look to go fishing in a few different places, if you will. And that's because, as I pointed out earlier, tropical cyclones are a global phenomenon. So it seemed important to look for tropical cyclone research written in other languages beyond English. With the support of our research team, we tapped some of our multilingual colleagues to help us conduct a literature review in Spanish, Portuguese, French, Japanese, and Chinese, in addition to English, using a few different search engines specific to these languages. So once we had all that searching straightened out and found our metaphorical oceans, we threw in some metaphorical nets. And then we began sifting through all of the results of our paper, all of the results of our searches, and identified papers that had methods and analyses that met our criteria. We did use a bunch of different screening criteria, but the criteria I want to kind of emphasize, or rather kind of the result was we were looking for what we call observational studies, or studies that take place on the ground. A disaster happens and a team comes in and makes observations about what trees have been damaged, as well as other characteristics following a hurricane. Those are the type of studies we collected in this literature review. So our initial search turned up over 5,000 papers. We had a lot of screening to do. And after that screening process, 64 of them met our eligibility requirements. And of those, 55, so most of them were in English, but we also identified a few studies that met our criteria that were in Chinese, Japanese, and Spanish. One of the first things we did was, for our keeper papers, was we split them into urban and rural studies. For this, the purpose of this project, we used a broad definition of urban, which resulted in, which found 13 studies. And this includes trees that are both very obviously located in the built environment, so like street trees or residential trees, as well as natural areas that are very much embedded in an urban setting. What you can hopefully gather from this aerial photo here of a kind of riparian park that is surrounded on all sides by urban development. By contrast, we found many more rural studies, 52 in total, which are classified as other natural areas that are much farther from the influence of intense development. So you can see from this map that most of our studies took place in North America and the Caribbean, though we do have representation from Asia, as well as one study in Madagascar as well. This Venn diagram shows characteristics that are studied in both urban and rural settings. Some of these characteristics reflect the biological property of the tree, while others represent environmental conditions. Unsurprisingly, many of the urban-only predictors, they're related to urban conditions, such as infrastructure like buildings or pavement or utility lines. But you can also see there's quite a bit of overlap in the topics. So you might imagine with all those predictors, there's a lot of topics I could talk about. So I think for this presentation, rather than kind of speed running through everything we found, I'm going to highlight a few of the things that I think were kind of particularly interesting and hopefully most relevant to urban foresters and arborists. So first, probably the most commonly evaluated predictor is tree size, which most often is measured as DBH, or diameter at breast height. Most, but not all, studies find that generally bigger trees tend to be more likely to fail in a hurricane. And by failure, that, depending on the study, could include anything from the loss of branches to a trunk snapping to a tree falling over and flipping up at its root plate. Those are all types of damage that we inventoried in these studies. So this pattern of bigger trees tend to be more likely to fail has been observed both in urban and in rural studies, though most definitely there's can be a lot of nuance to that pattern, and as always, many exceptions to that general rule. Though less commonly evaluated, but perhaps nonetheless important predictors are also characteristics such as the slenderness of the tree, the ratio of trunk diameter to height, as well as the width of the crown relative to the trunk. Also tend to be important and valuable predictors, more so than simply looking at trunk diameter on its own. Also, unsurprisingly, several urban studies support the notion that many tree species differ in their ability to resist hurricane and wind damage. So this means that if we can identify wind-resistant species in a region, we can prioritize those species for planting in areas where they pose a greater risk if they're going to fail. So I've also been asked if native status is an important predictor of hurricane damage. So by native status, sorry, this is the part where my voice starts to give out. Anyways, native status, that just means if a species has been evolving in a location for a very, very long time. Every study does define that a little differently. In our review, we have 2 studies that found native species had greater survival compared to non-natives. And those studies took place in subtropical Florida and subtropical Japan. However, we have other studies out of Newfoundland, Canada, as well as North and Central Florida, who did not observe survival differences between native and non-native species. So kind of our best guess at the moment is that it may be what may be more important if a species comes from a part of the world where tropical cyclones occur frequently, as opposed to a species being native to a particular location. Though I definitely think this is a topic that would probably benefit from some additional and deeper investigation. So one factor that we, as urban foresters and arborists, can have some control over is where trees get planted in relation to other trees and infrastructure. It's possible that other trees and buildings can serve as windbreaks and reduce hurricane damage. So this was a topic examined for urban trees in managed areas by 4 studies out of Florida. 2 studies from the early 2000s, they evaluated the impacts of several hurricanes. This is the Duria research team. They found that urban trees that were planted in clusters or groups of 5 or more were less likely to die during a hurricane. We have 2 other studies out of Florida that focused solely on Hurricane Irma in 2017. And they found that overall canopy, or that when they looked at the overall canopy cover in the area surrounding their kind of target tree species, did not influence tree mortality. Similarly, the kind of proportion or the amount of buildings within the study plot were also not correlated with survival. So those are kind of contrasting results, interesting, kind of coming from the same region of the world, which I think kind of taken together and considering other anecdotal evidence that we've heard, it's certainly plausible for windbreaks, like other trees or buildings, to affect tree survival and hopefully reduce damage during hurricanes. However, from a research perspective, I think I don't really have a way to offer a lot of, I think, concrete or very particular recommendations or advice on this topic. Probably what's most useful is to really get to know your own sites and how wind behaves in your planting locations and use that to guide planting decisions for particular places. Another topic we can be responsible for is pruning. We have experimental research as well as anecdotal evidence that also suggests pruning that reduces the overall crown area can decrease hurricane damage to trees. And we have 2 studies out of Florida, or rather Florida, that kind of support this. One study kind of directly looked at pruning, and that was Mary Duria's work again. While one of the Hurricane Irma studies, while they didn't look at pruning explicitly, they did note that trees located under utility lines were less likely to be damaged during a hurricane. And that the authors assumed that most likely those trees were probably pruned and managed more intensively, which may have contributed to their higher survival and lower rates of damage. Risk assessment practices were examined by a few studies that we found. But I'm going to let Andrew tell you all about those studies in depth, since that's sort of the key core of his presentation. But the key point that I do want to emphasize is that these studies observed that when trees are rated as having a high likelihood of failure, indeed, they do fail more frequently during a hurricane. And I think that's a really great insight, because it means that urban foresters and arborists already have a tool at their disposal to identify high-risk trees and take appropriate mitigation to reduce the likelihood of failure before a storm arrives. So this one's takes a little different direction, but a topic that came up in rural forest studies that I think is kind of relevant to the care and management of urban natural areas are woody vines, also called lianas. So trees in rural studies, trees with more woody vines growing on them were more likely to break or fall over. And importantly, also following hurricanes, vine abundance tends to increase, especially along the edges of forests. And since our urban natural areas and remnants tend to be highly fragmented and having a high edge to area ratio, I think the interaction of vines and trees and hurricanes is a topic that warrants further investigation. So you probably noticed that I've made reference to a lot of urban hurricane research in Florida. In hindsight, since in probably at least the United Kingdom part of the world, it's dinner time, you probably could have made a good drinking game out of that. Sorry about that. But importantly, I bring this up to highlight that there's absolutely a need for urban research in other climate zones, in addition to just other parts of the world. Unfortunately, again, it's easy, or because of the frequency of hurricanes that arrive in Florida. But these are important drivers of disturbance in subtropical and temperate and even sometimes boreal, as well as semi-arid down in Australia habitats as well. And it's important that we're being robust in where we collect our research data. So kind of to sum things up, our research highlights that there are many valuable practices that can be incorporated into our forest management that can increase the resilience of urban trees in the face of hurricanes. And those are practices like careful species selection, thinking about site selection in relation to potential wind damage, preemptively pruning to reduce overall crown area and crown drag, and conducting risk assessments that can help us prioritize and identify high-risk trees. And taken together, these can help us mitigate damage and prevent damage before it happens, instead of always putting us in this sort of reactionary position where we're always just in natural disaster cleanup mode. We do have options to kind of prepare the urban forest before disaster strikes. And as well, there are a lot of exciting opportunities and avenues for future research to help us kind of further understand these processes and refine our practices and recommendations. So with that, that's my talk. Thank you so much for your attention. Feel free to reach out to learn more about our research. I think we're doing a joint Q&A at the end. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and let Andrew get started. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Allyson. That was really, really interesting. And I didn't realize you just recovered from COVID. So thank you you did very well. So well done. And there's lots of love for the presentation. Everyone, all these young people who speak cartoon are showing their appreciation by sending little pictures of hands or something. It baffles me, but I think they're happy. Brilliant. And one thing I forgot to say at the start, there will be CEU codes available or credits available, and I'll give you a code later on. So that'll be fine. And now let's move on to Andrew. Andrew, over to you.
Okay, you can see my full slides, right? Okay, cool. And yeah, thanks so much, Allyson. I know the only talk I've ever missed was because of COVID and losing my voice. So I know how rough that was for you. So my talk is called Which Defects Are Truly Defective? And there's a question mark there because we're probably not going to end this talk with any kind of, rock solid agreement on that. But what happened is Allyson did a lot of research on there, brought up a lot of great studies, and I did a deep dive on one area of it that really means a lot to me as an arborist, and I think will resonate with you as well. So I'm going to start this with a little story. So during COVID 2020, my car had some electrical gremlins and just started giving me problems unexpectedly. And I was placing sensors, doing things over and over again. I was at AutoZone near weekly, fixing things on this thing. And eventually I just gave up on it. And I bought a car with no research, essentially. I didn't have any preconception that I wanted to buy a car or that I wanted to invest in any way. All I knew is that I had 4 kids. I had a limited budget because I work for the state, and I needed something big enough and cheap enough that I could afford that wouldn't give me any hassles. So I looked all online, and within a few hours, I found the cheapest, biggest thing that I could get that had decent ratings, and I bought myself a Kia Sorento. So I went from not ever knowing that this car really existed, not really caring about this car, to owning it. And the moment I owned it, I saw it everywhere. I saw it everywhere I drove. And I'm sure folks here have had that same experience, right? And I think we can probably have this an analog for that for actual tree identification, probably you felt that experience. Once you know a tree, you see it everywhere. And then defect identification. So once we've been exposed to the idea of tree defects and visual defect assessment, the moment we know what they are, we start seeing them everywhere, right? And we can no longer enjoy a tree just for what that tree is. And defects, they have, a history. Alex Shigo, pathologist with the U.S. Forest Service, he started some of the earlier guides. This guide came out the same year I was born, Tree Defects, a photo guide. And, this is an expanded concept of decay and coat it, used to re-examine many tree problems from discolored and decayed wood. And there are major problems that cause low quality in trees. And it's just helping us see externally what can be causing problems internally, right? And since then, defects have been even more common in our literature. So, there's private books by folks like Ed Hayes. There's Body Language of Trees, which was translated, and I have a copy of that myself. Thank you for translating it for us over there. There's a newer version of it, which shows this tree that just has every single affliction whatsoever that you can imagine. Just is a visual reference of what you can expect. And then the tree risk assessment method that ISA, International Society of Arboriculture, has is very defect focused. One of the main chapters in that book is actually looking at defects after defect after defect and giving them a kind of a set likelihood of failure rating in more detail than they go in other aspects of the risk assessment. And it takes up quite a bit of their risk assessment form. It's a major real estate holder in that document. So with this focus on defects and in the literature and in our risk assessment methods, it's no surprise to us that we start seeing these things everywhere, right? And we focus on them, and they can be a cause of concern and strife for people. So, and not only do we see them and we think about them, but they also kind of weigh in on how we assess trees. This is a study I did when I first started here at Florida. And what we did is we had these random kind of pictures of trees, and they had different targets, whether it's a person or a building or a car, how close or far away it was. Some of them weren't even within fall range. We looked at different species that can compartmentalize well and that didn't. And when we looked at all these things and we just randomized them, and then we had people rate their gut level risk rating, arborists that were both professionals and with credentials and more beginning arborists, we found that the defect was by far the biggest driver of their risk rating. 50% or more of their risk rating was just based purely on the defect alone, barely taking into things like consequences of failure or target, when left to their own devices and not forced to work through some sort of form, right? And we see them all over. So here's one study I did of Tom Smiley. This was Hurricane Matthew hit Savannah, Georgia in the United States, and Charleston, South Carolina, southeastern cities, kind of historic cities. Bartlett tree experts in town, they had done risk assessments on a number of properties. And in doing this, our data set had 269 trees, and only 10 of them in the data set had no defects, right? So, when you look at what's in the track manual, the ISA manual, those things are prevalent on many, many trees, right? And the median number of defects per tree was 2. And some poor trees in that data set had 6 defects, right? So they're so prevalent when we look for them, yet 93% of the trees in that data set did not fail, despite nearly having 100% coverage and defects. And why is that? Well, if we go back in time, we go back to Alex Shigo, where we started this talk. He was looking at a different thing than we were. When we think about defects, we think about structural defects and how they can affect whether a tree survives a storm intact or not. He was working for the Forest Service, where he was selling timber and wood. I mean, the Forest Service was looking at it from a timber's perspective, and he was looking for problems that would cause degradation of that product, right? Not so much whether or not it was going to cause a tree to fall over or not. And, decay will cause a tree to fall, and it will also cause a tree to be less sellable. So there's a little bit of analog, and it does apply in some regard. So arborists have taken the idea of defects and studied it quite extensively. And often we do biomechanics experiments. We're pulling trees apart. We're pulling them over with winches. We're putting them in material testing equipment to see if their unions are stronger or weaker. But that gets at one question, which is how much do defects weaken a tree, right? But I think probably the more pressing question, and one that we're trying to get at with engineering things, is how strong does a tree need to be? How strong does that tree need to be? And I guess how weak is too weak, right? And the most direct way to get at that is to look at a population of trees that went through a storm. But direct doesn't always mean easy, so you need a couple of things in place to really get this research right. You need a population of trees that has been risk assessed before the storm. You need that storm to hit you. It has to be the right kind of storm. It has to be nothing too severe. It can't be like a category 3 or 4 or 5 hurricane, because nothing's going to make it. It has to be a storm that we managed for as arborists. That storm has to be the right intensity, but also has to hit within a short amount of time. If you have a 2-year window or 2-year time frame on your risk assessment, or a 5-year time frame, the clock's ticking for that storm to hit, which can really limit the ability for these data sets to be used. And then once that perfect storm hits within the right amount of time on your pre-risk assessed data set, you need the money to get back there rapidly, because storm cleanup happens right away, especially along main roads and hospital ways and utilities and things like that. So, and all these things are pretty rare. And as you'll see, the result is this research is pretty rare. Allyson, she showed you this slide, so I'm not going to go into too much. But we were looking at, a bunch of storms that are pretty much windstorms. We didn't look at ice storms for this. We also didn't look at tornadoes, because those are their own beast altogether. So this is a preliminary table. She stared at me and I latched onto it, but it was looking at a bunch of different predictors that were showing up in the data sets that she was finding. And of these, arborists look at things like DBH, species, wind speed. Maybe, we think about that, at least when we're thinking about the conditions that we would likely expect to experience. Crown form, height, pruning, defects, presence or absence, rooting space, likelihood of failure ratings, and even like the grouping, the basal area, right? The things we fixate on, there are very few studies out there. At the time, at this point in the study, there were 3. I think 2 of them actually made it into the final paper. And so we had like 3 studies where there's actually defects being looked at in this regard, pre and post storm. But we've added some since then. I've added some myself, and we'll go through those right now. So one of the first papers that kind of attempted to do this was out of California. It was by Gary Hickman et al., and it was on an oak tree hazard assessment system that they came up with out there. And they looked at 695 park trees in Lodi, California in 1987. And this was a kind of a cool park system in that it was kind of natural, and they just let trees fail. And then after they failed, that's when they would come in with crews and clean them up. They weren't doing some preemptive risk mitigation. They had their own 9-component risk rating system. And they came back about 7 or 8 years later, and they found that 60 trees had failed in that time. So this is kind of like the pre-time frame kind of point of view. There were storms there, but they didn't capture any one particular storm. It was just the passage of time. But they looked to see if soil, the amount of soil space and pavement that was over roots affected failure. If roots were cut or not, if there were wounds, decay, loose barks in the butt of the tree, wounds, decay, loose bark in the trunk of the tree, Defects like codominance included barks, cracks, and decay in the limbs. There was a lean, how much wind exposure there was, and then if there was visual decline. And so some of these were actually significant predictors. The next paper that kind of looks at this sort of data is by Brian Kane. Brian Kane, you probably know him. He is out of Massachusetts, and he looked at a windstorm that hit a campsite in Brewster. This is the Cape Cod region of Massachusetts. I'm going to murder that word. I got to be careful there. And it was 100-mile-per-hour winds, which I should have put the metric equivalent in there. Sorry. The campsite was inventoried prior to the storm using the USDA Forest Service risk assessment method, which includes things like decay and codoms, include barks. And they also captured some recent pruning and mitigation work to see if that had an effect, which was kind of cool. So they looked at the species, they looked at whether the tree had failed or not, and what level of failure they had, whether the tree had been pruned in the past or was nearby to trees that had been removed and had more exposure than it was experiencing before. And then if they had dead branches, decay, cavities, poor branch attachments, or cut roots. The next study was one that I did with Tom Smiley, the one I talked about a little bit earlier. And this was Hurricane Matthew. Hurricane Matthew kind of rode along the eastern coast of the United States, finally getting close enough to touch land in South Carolina. It was relatively close to Savannah, and then it had made landfall by the time it hit Charleston. In this data set, there were 269 trees. This was using the ISA risk assessment form, the track form, or the BMP form. And then they listed defects and likelihood of failure as predictors. And all these folks were arborists who had pretty much all the credentials you could get that were doing the risk assessments. This storm right here hit Savannah, Georgia at 85 kilometers per hour, and Charleston, South Carolina, a little bit more diminished at 69 kilometers per hour, which puts us at a tropical storm range, which is kind of an ideal storm. It's kind of like the perfect storm for this kind of research because it's essentially a slightly stronger thunderstorm. And the next paper that came out is the most recent of them, and that is one that I did with Brian Kane again, and with Mike Nelson, who was a really kind of a whiz-bang geospatial analyst at University of Massachusetts. And this was Hurricane Irma data from the city of Tampa. So these were risk assessments that had been done, a number of risk assessments over a number of years in the 2 to 4 years prior to the storm. And we had a 5-year time frame, so everything was kind of within that right time frame. We revisited the storm a couple of weeks later in the winter and spring after the storm had hit, which was in early October. So actually 2 or 3 months later. And we had used the USDA Forest Service risk assessment method to risk assess these. And there were 2,394 trees in this data set. Again, this was a little bit more, it was a little stronger than we probably wanted. It was a category 1. And we had sustained winds of over 50 miles per hour, or in the 115 to 153 kilometer per hour kind of mark when it comes to gusts. And then this one, we looked at things like where the trees were located, and we did some geospatial assessment based on nearby buildings and stuff, which failed to show any kind of pattern. Trees kind of survived the storm on their own. The spacing just wasn't close enough for grouping to really matter. We had species, size, cankers, cracks, dead wood, decayed wood, poor branch architecture, which could be on a number of things, which we'll talk about, root problems, and then weak branch unions. And you can see here, these are all binary. So they're yes or no, which we'll talk about later. So here are the results of this work. What I'm going to show you is a defect. I'm going to show you a picture of it. And then I'm going to show you the 4 studies, right? And if the study is present on the slide, it was studied by that group. If it has a green arrow going up, it led to more failures. If it has a green arrow going down, it actually led to less failures, which happens a few times. And then if there are arrows going back and forth, it was studied, but there was no ability to predict, right? Apparently, sore throats are catching. So cracks. Cracks range in their severity. Horizontal being move the car, shear plane being maybe less significant. The track manual for ISA cause them like the 2 highest levels of failure: probable likelihood of failure and imminent likelihood of failure. The 2 studies that looked at cracks, and I will say from my experience, cracks are really rare, so it's hard to study these. They did not predict failure, and that could be maybe an aspect of just low numbers in the data set. Sorry. Codominant stems. We know that anyone who's kind of familiar with codominant stems know that they're treated a little bit differently. The wider U-shaped codominant stems usually have a lower rating of improbable or possible, according to ISA's track manual. When they're tighter, and these are without included bark, by the way, they're listed as possible or probable by ISA. They've never predicted failure, and these things are common. So the paper out of California, my work out of South Carolina and Georgia, and then also in Tampa, we've never had it predict failure. And codominance with included bark. When it was studied in California, again, no relationship whatsoever. And unfortunately, this kind of sucked for us. When we were trying to explain this, is we actually saw fewer trees with codominant stems with included bark actually failed less in our data set for Hurricane Matthew. And that was, I attributed it to the fact that the only species that had codominant stems in our data set were live oak, which live oak just doesn't care. That tree, you can crash a car into it. Cannonballs bounce off of it when you make boats out of it. It's a very tough tree. Adventitious shoots. If the tree loses its canopy because of arborists or because of a windstorm, and it just puts a bunch of shoots up really quickly to regain its canopy. Those are weakly attached at first, but over time, more holding wood will be developed and they will grow stronger. So with holding wood, they're improbable to possible, according to the ISA. With no decay, they rise up to possible, and then with decay, then they'll be elevated risk all the way to probable, according to the guidebook. We've never had any data sets in literature that can support that. So again, that's kind of a special case. You almost have to find an area that has some really shoddy work or has been hit by storms over and over again. Multiple branches emerging from the same point. Less holding wood in theory. Often this is a result from nurseries topping a tree to get it branchier before sale. Possible to probable according to the track manual from ISA. No relationship in any of the research. Okay, please, come on. Some relationships, right? If it's going to happen, it's going to happen here. So dead, broken, and hanging branches. Hanging branches are imminent. That's a failure before your eyes. Dead branches do not have long on this earth in places like Florida, where we have really active decay fungi that move really quickly. So it can range from possible to imminent, depending on where you are and how the tree, how the decay resistant tree and things like that. Yes, thank you. Decay, dead branches and decay. The dead branches in this case, both of them were significant in the studies where they were studied. So that's kind of our check on reality, right? When you see something that it has to be significant and it shows up in your data sets as such, you're like, okay, there is something there. And when you see things that are definitely you're not worried about and it shows something, you feel good too. It's in those marginal cases where you're like, okay, is the data really showing us something, right? Seams and ribs. I won't go into this too long because they're so rare that we don't have them in any data sets. That they do happen, you see them, but they're not common like some of the other branching defects because there's just so many more branches, right? Leans, differentiating between a corrected lean that has failed a while ago, but has been able to reroute and is actually, we have gravitropism taking place, versus an uncorrected lean, which is something more recent, which we don't know if it's going to stay where it is or go down. They can run the whole gambit, right? In the Hickman paper, there was a significant relationship, but in the Hurricane Matthew and in the Hurricane Irma papers, there was no relationship. So, and then there's a whole slew of defects in the track manual that have never been studied ever. And they don't even give any sort of guidance on them. They just said, notice these things. So things that are not in the track manual that we've seen in the research are dieback has increased likelihood of failure in some studies. Wounding. So if, we talk about pruning, right? We're probably one of the main culprits of like wounding in trees. So if you're removing big branches, especially in poor compartmentalizing trees, you could be causing more harm than good. And there's kind of some evidence of that in at least 2 studies. Deep planting was found to be a source of failure in the Hurricane Matthew paper. And then, of course, this is another one of those checks on reality where like, please, decay and cavities largely are increasing failure rates. So, and again, that's decay. These are binary variables. Decay is a continuum, right? So there is that noise there in the data. And then stem girdling roots also increased failure. So that some of you may have seen, especially the Florida folks in the audience. I saw some of my folks from my state here. Here's some new findings. So looking at all those slides before, my team honed in on a few key defects where we were surprised at what we had seen in historic literature. And we're like, and some of them were like, well, is this really a thing? Right. So we wanted to get some more evidence for this. So luckily or unluckily, it did not take long for us to have a storm. That's one of the blessings of living in Florida, is that I get new data pretty much every year. The curse is that I may not have a house after it happens, but my kids can sleep at night knowing that dad's going to have a sweet data set, So, so Hurricane Irma hit Fort Myers, which is pretty far south of where our data set was, in Tampa. So even though it's a very strong storm that caused a lot of damage, it was pretty mild by the time in these outer bands that hit our data set. Our data set was a Hillsborough County Park District. I had risk assessed 140 some parks with my team as part of a risk management plan that we're doing as our outreach program. And it was like 11,000 trees, and these parks got hit by essentially a Category 1 storm. Whoops. Sorry, folks. Got a little, there we go. This is an example of our park map. So every park that we assessed, we made a GIS map of, and we marked all the assets, including the main trees in managed areas. And each one of those trees had a risk assessment with a key defect. We called it the most pressing defect, the defect of concern. And that was the defect that was most likely to fail and cause the most damage, that combination of likelihood and consequences of failure. 11,000 trees, essentially, as I said. And what we were able to do is just hone in on the defects that we were interested in and go right to them on these maps and use these, in the field to get right to the trees and very quickly look at the trees that we were filtering for to see if the defects really didn't matter in this case. The defects that we were filtering for in this reassessment were codominant stems. Codominant stems have included bark. Surprise there, right? And then multiple branches emerging from one point. And also overextended branches, which I did not have here. And there was only 12 of those. So we found 1,519 trees where the primary defect of concern was one of those 4 defects that had shocked us a little bit in the past with the past research. The vast majority of those were codominant stems, or then the next would be multiple branches emerging from the same point. There were 83 that had included bark and 12 that had overextended branches that stick out beyond the normal canopy of the tree. Of those 1,519 trees that we went to, 14 of them had lost a branch during the storm, which was a Category 1 hurricane. And then what we had done is we had said, okay, when we're looking for a branch failure, if it occurs at say you're looking at a codominant stem as a defect of concern, if it occurs at any codominant stem, we're going to call it a yes, because it happened at a defect of concern. Even if it wasn't the right codominant stem, we're just going to go with that, right? If we can't tell, we'll put a question mark because there could be uncertainty in research. And if we can tell for sure that it didn't happen at a codominant stem or whatever the defect was, we're going to put a no, because maybe it's happening at internodal, right? And you can just tell it broke mid-branch somewhere. Well, of those 14 trees those 14 branch failures we had, not a single one actually happened at a defect of concern in that 1,519 tree data set. We're writing it up right now, and I know this is going to get people upset because I just was talking to a collaborator on the project and about it, and he's just like, but I've seen these things fail in the field, So I can't say why we had so little in the Tampa data set, but I can say why other data sets we may not be having a predictive effect on these defects, right? So you're going out after a storm and you see a codominant stem that's broken, right? Or a branch of included bark. You take that picture, right? And you're like, it just registers you that, yes, that defect was significant. And this is the proof that's kind of backing up my preconception, right? How many other branches that failed elsewhere at a place you didn't think of as a defect have you been really looking at? To an example, after Hurricane Ian, I was with a friend who was an arborist. He'd let me stay at his place, and we're looking in the yard, and he looks, oh gosh, there's a branch, and it's a 90-degree angle, and of course, it's a torsional break. It broke right there. Makes sense. And I looked on the ground, and there's 3 other branches that were internodal. I'm like, what about those 3? He's like, I don't know. When people actually look at non-defective failure rates, trees that don't have any defects, it's a pretty interesting picture. So your Great Storm of 1987, Gilbert and Gregg did a write-up of this in 1990, and they only looked at 3 defects back then, which kind of shows you how defects have been growing over the years, right? They found that when you looked at all the defects, their failure rate was 21.4%. And when you look at trees that had no defects before the storm that they could see, failure rate was 18.6%. So like a 3% difference, which is statistically different, but realistically, it's pretty close, right? And mathematics often have a hard time discerning signals when you have these kind of relationships where the thing you're looking for causes about the same, and the thing that should be your control is about the same. It just mathematically, even though there are things failing with included bark and with codominant stems, there's a ton of stuff that we're not looking at that is also failing, right? And then here's Kane. He looked at all the Forest Service defects, and they had a 7.8% failure rate for defects and a 21.8% failure rate for trees that had no defects, which took some digging in the tables to figure out, but it was kind of an eye-opener for me, right? Also worth noting is that defects range in severity. So this is some work by Duncan Slater, I'm sure you're well aware of this, showing that included bark is not all the same. But the data that we're getting is a checkbox, yes or no, it has included bark. And that's a limitation of the research, but it's also a limitation of the risk assessment method, right? If that's the data that we're looking at to make our assessments, it's just, it has it or not. And I think the savvy consultants out there will know that these are different, but then the newbies that are using this form may be tricked into thinking that the risk is higher than it is. And then some conclusions, and I'm done. I'm going a little bit over, but I tried to get it all in. So conclusions. Most trees have defects from what we've seen in the data. at least the recent stuff that I've had my hands on. But yet most trees survive storms intact. For example, that cane paper in Brewster, Maryland, 2/3 of the trees had defects, yet there was an overall failure rate of 12%, right? While defects may reduce strength in mechanical testing, it remains unclear how strong trees actually need to be to survive storms. So when we're breaking branches in a static manner, we have to do some mathematical and theoretical leaps to put it into a dynamic kind of context. And that's what these pre and post storms do on their own. It makes it a dynamic system that we're measuring, and we can see that messiness and all, right? And while some defects are definitely a concern, others may warrant future observation, may only warrant future observation, or maybe no observation, honestly. Because, we just keep adding defects. I mean, the Gilbert and Gregg paper has 3 defects they look at. And you saw like how many, like 24 or so defects that are in the track manual right now. And every time there's going to be a revision, I suspect there'll be someone who wants to add their defect that they've, trying to create for themselves that they've seen. And it'll keep adding to the list without any kind of, is this really, any kind of assessment of, is this really need to still be in here, right? So I think when these things are updated, we should really have some pause and kind of look at the data that's out there and make some decisions on how they're characterized in guidebooks. And because there's a cost to this, taking a bunch of data so that every single tree has a defect on it in a data set, like some of those data sets we showed you have, is wasted time. And I know that it's kind of like a cover your behind thing, so like if someone thinks it's a defect and you marked it, like from a litigation point of view, you're okay. But there's a kind of a darker side to it too, right? If someone really wants a tree removed, there's so many options to look at to get that tree to the rating that'll get it above a threshold that'll mitigate or like negate any protections that tree has, given the local ordinances you have. So we need to, and that happens. It happens in Florida. We had a new state statute where any unsafe or dangerous tree is no longer protected, even though there were local ordinances in place before. So this I've seen it. And the last thought is, for as much stock as people place in defect assessment, 7 studies, in actual real world environments, that's not a lot. And one of them was in the UK, and one of them was in Massachusetts, which is kind of a temperate environment, and then a bunch of them were in Florida, right? So we need more. So yeah, that's what I have, and I'm ready for questions.
Woo! Thank you very much, Andrew. I got a little post-it note on here that tells me to say a CEU code. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Lots of questions, lots of chat. Everyone's happy, other than with the use of the word defects. I reckon we could have a very long webinar just about whether or not we should use the word defects. We'll talk a bit about that in a minute. CEU code. Hang on a minute, folks. Let me share my screen. Bumpty dumpty dumpty dum. How does it work? You think I know how this will work by now. Why is that doing that? Oh, I see. Get rid of that. Oh my God, I've done this a lot of times, but it's not working. It's 008 is the code. Can you see that? Yeah, you can see that. UI23008 is the tonight's lucky numbers. If you enter that number, you will receive some CEUs from the ISA. So there you go. We'll put it in the chat in a minute as well. Right. On to business. Questions. Some of these are quite specific, going back to Allison's presentation particularly. So we'll start off with a question from Ian, who's asking, why did such a small percentage of the Japanese studies pass the screening criteria?
Sure. First up, I want to say thanks to the chat, really fascinating and thoughtful discussion I've been catching up with and following along with in there. So thank you to everyone contributing to that. It's I love seeing that during a webinar. The reason was more that the particular Japanese database we used, the search engine was produced results that were like far too broad. So I think Ian keenly noticed that we had like 5,000 hits for our search terms in that for the Japanese search engine, but the majority of those papers were just completely irrelevant that we had to sift through. That was just a quirk of that particular database. Did not like our use of Boolean strings, unfortunately. So it was a little too generic. So that's why it's not a reflection on the quality of Japanese research.
Makes sense. Thank you very much. Right, Andrew. You mentioned Duncan Slater a couple of times. We love Duncan. Ian, it's Ian again. Ian, stop asking so many good questions. You're hogging the questions and it's my fault. Ian said, did any of the co-dominant studies investigate whether there were natural braces in any of the canopies and rework the aggregate data on that basis? Duncan's done a lot of work on natural bracing. Did that come into your work at all?
Unfortunately not. So we did 2 risk assessment methods that were in the ones that were, that's a relatively new phenomenon that in the kind of the psyche and the discussion of the industry, right? So the research is, a couple of years old, but it's taken a while to catch up. And so the risk assessment methods that we use in our risk assessment, like the track assessment, the USDA Forest Service, and then like that homegrown method in California, none of those even have it as something to consider, right? So if the data is not there, we can't assess it. But I would encourage people to add it to their own forms, especially if you work for municipal government. If you're collecting risk data and you happen to be smited just a little bit and want to talk to me, I would love to collect it and look at it. So.
Thank you. Andrew loves his data. Send it in. Okay, thank you. There's a few people saying they need certificates. You will receive a certificate. If when you register, there's a little box you tick to say, I would like a certificate. You will get your certificate with our blessings. And if you don't get it, then please pester us and we will send it to you. Right, Allyson, a question from Paula. Has the team managed to develop a high-risk tree matrix?
No, not yet. We're hoping, like I said, one of our project goals is to take the original Duria list and be able to add additional species to it. And I'm not sure risk is, for at least the tropical cyclone work, would be the correct word. Obviously, risk is highly context dependent, but this is just when we look at our goal is more when you look at the kind of common biological properties of a particular species, do they lend themselves to a tree being able to tolerate high winds, or does that tree respond by breaking branches really easily or snapping at its trunk or some other type of failure?
Brilliant. Thank you very much. What am I looking at? So I've got too many things open. It's all very confusing, but I promise it's all relevant to the webinar. It's like I'm watching TV here or something. Right, Andrew, we're going to bust open this subject about defects because there's lots of people very excited. I'll start off with a comment from my dear friend Piotr in Poland, who's just come back from Ukraine, by the way, and is doing some amazing work in Ukraine. So big love for Piotr. Piotr says, I object to the term defect, as there are only features and some may be leading to tree failure, particularly if they coincide or overlap. Also, Andrew said, the word defect suggests it will fail and we feel obliged to deal with it. Maybe we should call these defects features. There's been a lot of conversation about stuff like that. I remember personally when I was managing trees working with a database where a defect was something you had to implement a solution for. You had to fix the defect and the system didn't understand. You could have a defect that you didn't need to deal with. So is defect the wrong term for all of this?
Yeah, I'd say, and a defect is also conflated with like defects in the wood quality, so like I would say a feature is a great term. I think I might have even used that in the paper as like a kind of catch-all for it, because we don't have to deal with all these. And the moment people see defect, they jump on it. Kind of like we got away from hazard to risk. I'm not sure if the general public treats that any differently, but the attempt was to get away from a tree being something that needs to be mitigated just because it's going to cause harm, right? Something that has to be contained. And defects kind of have that same negative connotation. So I agree. Get rid of it.
Allyson, have you got any thoughts on that at all? It's the chat's raging, as you've seen. People are very exercised about this. What do you think?
So risk assessment is, first off, not my strong suit. And I had not contemplated that question until today, but I think the features camp makes a really compelling argument. So I really, really appreciate that.
They're a smart audience we've got here. They may seem a bit odd, but they're great, really, and they like to contribute. Nola says defect needs to be ditched. I think I agree with you, Nola. Right, okay. What have I picked out next? We've had a bit of talk about soil as well as a factor in this sort of failure. There's two questions. I'll lump them together. I'm never successful when I do this, but I'll try. Michael said, are flipped root plates not indicative of soil failure rather than tree failure? And have the effects of rain on the soil been separated from tree size? And then Ian, getting in a third question of the night, has talked about, for the rural studies that did include soil type, was there any pattern to whole tree failure associated with soil type? And was there any rooting volume data for urban studies? So two very different questions, but all focusing on the same thing. To what extent is soil playing a factor here?
Sure. Okay. So one short answer is that generally speaking, and really disappointingly, soil is not frequently studied in most of this research, or at least the body of research that we captured. I will point to, it's not tropical cyclone related research, but it is very severe storm work out of Minnesota, with Gary Johnson's team, did a great study where they documented regarding questions about sidewalk and soil volume. And I think there was a question about construction activity. They documented that trees that had been exposed to sidewalk replacement were more likely to fail during windstorms, and trees in smaller soil volumes also didn't do so hot. But for like tropical cyclone exclusive research, specific research that's really not, for whatever reasons, probably time. This research typically has to be done really quickly and with limited resources. Soil is not frequently evaluated. So I think Mary Duria's team, one of their studies did look at soil volume. What was the result of that one? And saw that I believe more soil volume generally is associated with less failure. But is just generally a topic I would love to see investigated more carefully and more thoroughly. What else? Other aspects do we need to hit on? The question of, is it tree failure if it's a root plate flip? That's also a topic I have not contemplated. I certainly see the perspective. Maybe it's kind of a bit of both, in that, right, sometimes if a tree isn't able to perhaps grow its root plate as large as it needs, or doesn't have the great root architecture for the site where it's planted, right? Maybe it's a little bit of both, a little bit of failure on the part of the tree and the part of the soil. But I'm glad that was brought up. I think that's just generally an avenue of we could use more research on. Someone else made a good point that I am forgetting now. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
See, these webinars always generate more questions than answers. But go away, Allyson, research all the soil stuff, then come back. And you can do another
if someone would like to give me money to do that, and we can find a good hurricane to come through, sure. I'm on it.
We can fix. In fact, it's probably easier to arrange the hurricane than it is to arrange the money. But thank you very much. where are we? We've got a few minutes left. What was I going to ask? This is a good question, I think, from Rachel. I'll kind of throw it out to both of you, I guess. Rachel's saying, do you know of any studies that compare trees which are uprooted or snapped by a storm with neighbouring trees that survived? So have you been able to assess the factors that made the difference? And then could we use that information to foresee failure? Is there that sort of comparative study between the survivors and those?
There are, yeah. Yes. So a lot of studies actually utilize that technique. There's one out of Newfoundland, Canada. They kind of did like a paired. They found like whatever tree broke, and then the one closest to it, like what were its characteristics. So that is a very useful technique, and it's great when studies report that kind of data. So good thinking, and feel free to collect your own data that way as well. And then call Andrew.
And we're all hungry for data. We had another question, a general question, one for me really, about getting recordings of the presentations. They'll be made available on our website in the coming weeks, so you'll get that. And there's some people asking for quite specific studies, which I've now lost, but we'll send all of the questions to our speakers. And if you want to ask any additional stuff, john@trees.org.uk, and I'm sure we can get those papers and stuff for you somehow. Right, I've got a couple more questions. We've got plenty of time. I feel like we're rushing. It's cool, we've got plenty of time. Andrew, Adams asked, have fungal pathogens been taken into consideration? Is there research of the presence of fungi alongside the presence of defects? Adam's saying that the removal of cellulose and or lignin could assist in the failure. So to what extent has that been considered?
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying from like a research point of view, it's kind of just generally lumped into decay, so the presence or absence of it, sometimes the extent of it. So I will say that the way that would have showed up in the data sets would be when you look at the relationship between the yes or of, having a factor that's yes decay and then the likelihood of failure rating. So like then the arborist who was assessing it was using his or her best judgment based on all those things to get a likelihood of failure rating. And that was really quite correlated with failure rates, which was kind of nice to see. It was, again, as Allyson said, it was a nice check on reality that the things we were doing are actually working. And it happened for both the Forest Service data set, like that risk assessment method, and then the track method. I have every faith that the methods you use, QTRA, valid, would probably do the same because they have very similar kind of structures, along with differences that make them different. So, but yeah, we very rarely would they go as far as to like culture things out or identify things and then see if a specific fungal pathogen is causing more or less, unless you saw something else. And
no, that's also in general, again, in the tropical cyclone research, disease, decay, pest infestations aren't really investigated in this context.
It's just to get like big data sets to make these models, you got to go coarse, unfortunately, because those cultures and stuff and that identification adds a lot of money to the research equation,
Mm.
Thank you very much. Paul's asked how many people joined the webinar series finale. The highest number I saw was about 525 watching, I think, but it's always a bit higher than that. So we've cleared 500 again. So that's wonderful. Bill has said I should be sweating about my WI meeting by now. I'm not sweating about my Women's Institute meeting, Bill, because a couple of weeks ago, I gave a presentation to a group called the Wednesday Wives. Yes, it wasn't as exciting as it sounds, but I survived that, so I can survive this, I'm sure. Right, possibly one last question. We'll see how we go. From Sarah, for Allyson specifically, but Andrew, chip in as well if you feel the need. Sarah says, do trees that survive one strong wind show more or less resilience to subsequent high wind events?
I think I've seen a study like that actually. So Seth,
I'm going through like my Rolodex of like all the studies we looked at. You want to answer that while I keep thinking, Andrew?
I know that Seth Geikema did some utility work and found that there were less outages for like stretches of utility corridor that had more recent storms, right? Because essentially the wind is kind of pruning out the deadwood the first time.
Yeah. And
whatever kind of makes it is kind of more resilient initially. It's kind of a biasing effect, you know?
Yeah. So I'll say at the population level, so like in the population of a forest, urban or rural, like that, unless this is all, again, highly context dependent, like the second storm that comes through, you tend to see less damage because a lot of that first storm culled a lot of the weaker trees and or things like weak branches that come out in that first storm. And so you'll see less damage in the second storm. That's supported by research and anecdotal evidence for like a particular tree. You're not going to see, like, if a tree gets battered by one hurricane, it's not going to be like, oh, better grow tougher because hurricanes are coming. It doesn't quite function that way. Trees strengthen themselves in response to repeated, I think, lower stress. Is that correct, Andrew? Or am I explaining that correctly? Right. That's how trees strengthen or grow stronger wood, not in response to like extreme infrequent events. So
yeah, and I think like you could have like like the surrounding cover could be removed around it, and then it'll be exposed to different winds, and over time it could become stronger for that. But it also has more exposure at the same time. So
yeah, but great question.
And there's a couple just looking in the chat, Stuart and Jackie as well, talking about that's fine as long as the wind direction is the same. If the wind direction is different, then that's going to completely throw it off.
Yes.
Yeah, and luckily for hurricanes, trees get hit every direction because it just kind of swirls around. And at the beginning of the storm, they get hit one way, and then as the storm passes, they get hit the other way. So, which is always fun.
Thank you very much. Okay, look, if I get to this Women's Institute seminar late, there's going to be a riot. So we're going to wind it up in a minute. But there's one more question, and it's the question that we all want to know. And that question is, I'm going to go to you first, Allyson. So mainly because you look surprised when I said it, so I thought we'll go to you first.
I'm not surprised. You told me ahead of time, and I completely forgot.
Well, that's why I like to pick on the person who looks least ready for it. That's what we do here. Everyone's welcome. That's what we want to try and do. Allyson, what is your favorite tree-related book?
Great. I did have it, thank God, on my desk already. My favorite tree-related book is Forest Forensics by Forest Forensics by Tom Wessel. This is a North American, I think, oriented book, but it's the field guide that goes along with reading the forested landscape. So that's my fave. It's really helped me deepen my appreciation for the forests around where I live here in northern New Jersey. So.
Yeah, it's cool because it doesn't show like the cultural history behind trees, like grazing and things like that, kind of how.
Yeah, it connects both it connects forest ecology to the human activities of the landscape and our history. So I really appreciate it.
Oh, I like that one. I like all the books I'm going to suggest, but that sounds right up my street. I like that. I've taken a little note of that. I've not heard that before. Brilliant. So I'm just misusing my position as chair to find out what clever people like to read. That's all of this is just a sham, so I can put together a good reading list. Thank you, Allyson. Andrew, can you beat that?
I don't know if I can beat it, but I can add to it. So I don't really read a whole lot. I listen to audiobooks. I just devour them, right? So this one is called Lab Girl. It's by Hope Jaron. And she is a researcher. She's a botanist, and it's just like a kind of part biology part tree biology and how trees, persevere given the stresses that they encounter. And then her own personal story becoming a researcher and an enduring kind of like friendship she has. So like it hits so many different things. So if you love trees, it'll be great. If you love biographies, it'll be great. And then science and all that. I listened to it nonstop for 11 hours and 37 minutes, essentially, aside from sleeping. So good book.
Do you want the inside story about like why all us PhD people are like really weird and odd? That That's the behind the scenes into life as becoming a plant scientist.
Yeah, very good.
2 brilliant suggestions. Thank you so much, both. Well, look, we've come to an end. It's the end of the series, but don't be sad. You can, if you're sad, then next Wednesday you can just go onto the website and you can watch one of our old webinars and pretend it's live. That's what you can do. Just try and time it right so my beard doesn't grow and shrink at sort of weird intervals. You just want to try and watch it in order so it looks normal. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Allyson. That was absolutely brilliant. And you can see from the people waving their cartoons at you and from the chat, everybody loved it. We've still got more than 400 people on. It always seems a waste to say goodbye at this point, but we've got to, because we've all got important things to do. So thank you both so much. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to everyone who's joined us during this series, both speaking and participating, from all of your contributions in the chat and in the questions. It's really appreciated. It never fails to excite me how great it is, all these people watching it together and chatting in real time. I think it's very cool. So thank you all for that. People are asking various questions. It's too late. Look, this is the last bit. This is the bit where we cry and get weepy. Don't bring your questions to me now. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe. Look out for announcements about the next series, which will be whenever I come around to organising it, but I'm sure we'll do it relatively soon. Stay safe, and thank you all so much for your support. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.